Hey, I'm Carlo Prusa, and now I'm with a very special guest, former Strikeforce champion, Mr. Josh the Punk Thompson. Josh, what's going on, man?
What's up, my man? How are things?
Things are doing good, man. Just stuck in quarantine on lockdown. Can't really leave the house. Don't you love it?
I wouldn't say love is the word, but yeah.
Yo, all right, Josh. So, first question for you: how did you get into MMA? How did you get the burst? How did you get the start? How did you get the spark to want to compete?
I was already wrestling like college, and I was wrestling or playing soccer as well. So I was always pretty much in shape. But I was just saying this the other day. I said, I pretty much was. I was at 19 and 20 years old. I got done, in college, and I was like, all right, do I want to get a real job? Do I not want to? Like, those are things that you have to. Do you want to go work to a 9 to 5, or do you want to still be competitive? Randy Couture talked about this a while ago about how when he got in wrestling in college and he, he basically started fighting the UFC. He just was like, he didn't want to work a normal job. And so when it came down to it, he knew he still had a competitive drive in him to do something. He just didn't know what. Wrestling, this sport came along right at the right time for him. And I would say the same thing for me. It came along right at the right time for me as well. And so I was already training a little bit of jiu-jitsu. I was like 16, 17 when I was training jiu-jitsu a little bit and a little bit of Muay Thai. And after I had been training, for a while, it was like sporadic, maybe once or twice a week. It wasn't really, I was into it, but I also had wrestling and soccer, so I had other things going on. As soon as I turned 18, within like a year, they started having like fights all around the Northwest because I lived up in northern Idaho during that time. And they started having fights around that were kind of like in the area. So we started driving from place to place, sometimes in Portland, sometimes in Missoula, Montana, sometimes in Boise. So we started driving all around getting fights. And, I ended up loving the sport. Soccer kind of pretty much had come to a stop, outside of like indoor rec leagues and stuff like that. At the age, there's not really any club teams anymore. It's like, it's all for kids pretty much. And so wrestling, I was kind of getting tired of wrestling. College, I was getting tired of college as well. Just kind of a bunch of stuff. So this sport came along right at the right time. And like I was saying the other day, I talked about was John Jones is going through what I went through when I was like 19 and 20, except he's 32 now, or I believe 32. But it's like he's going through what I went. If I wasn't busy with wrestling and soccer and like other things, I was out fighting in the clubs. I was out, drinking and trying to pull chicks. I was like that. I was that person. I just figured it out at 19 and 20 years old. And don't get me wrong, I still did it all the way up until like 23, 24, that kind of thing. I didn't start getting my shit together till about 20, 25, 26, when I entered Strikeforce. So that's kind of what got me into it. I realized that I had to stay busy. I realized I was someone that needed to be active with a goal, and the ultimate goal was to make money. I loved training. I loved fighting. I loved being competitive. So the training aspect of it was never hard or difficult for me. I actually enjoyed being at the gym. I enjoyed being around the guys at the gym, and then just the chance to the potential of making money, man. Like $150 for the first fight, $300 for the second fight, $500 after that for like 6 or 7 fights. And then after that, I made the move back down to California because I was born and raised here in San Jose, but I made the move back down here to California and started training with Frank Shamrock and Javier Mendez, Bob Cook, at AKA back in 99, 98, 98, 99, somewhere around there, Bob Cook took a liking to me, and the two of us started really getting after it. He'd already fought, he was just about to fight in the UFC. And Frank obviously had been in the UFC for a while, was the champion there. It just kind of worked out for me, man. And, they started getting me fights for $500 here and there, and started getting me fights, for $1,000 here and there. And then next thing you know, I was, signed to a contract in the UFC. And I was like, all right, well, I'm 22 years old, got a contract to the UFC. Like, you can't get any higher than where you got to go. So that's kind of how it all started. It just was like, it was a trickle down. I started making a little bit of money, and I never, at that age, you don't need a lot of money to live. You just kind of pay, your rent's cheap. You're always trying to just rent a room or rent a place, but then you have roommates. And so your rent really isn't that cheap. You just got to learn how to take care of yourself. And that's all. And that's kind of how it all started, man.
Now, you mentioned that you lived a very reckless lifestyle at one time. Is that how you got the nickname the Punk? Is that what it originated from?
No, I was always the guy that kind of in the gym. I loved fighting. I loved being around the guys, but I was also the guy that liked to talk a lot of shit. And I would always not really instigate it, but I would I would encourage it, not just between me and that person, but between that person and somebody else. I would try to drag somebody else. We used to call it hooking, is I would hook you into to arguing with somebody else about something, and then I would walk away and just let you guys argue. So that was kind of how it all started.
I'm sure, I'm sure you've created some very interesting and hilarious situations by doing that.
Yeah, AK has been known to talk about it for a while, years now. But yeah, that was kind of my whole thing. And then the other thing as well is it was kind of I would talk. It didn't matter who you were. It could be Paul Bonatello. It could be Mike Kyle. It could be anybody, man. I mean, I would talk, anybody. I would talk shit to them. And sometimes it came to blows, like real blows, in the gym, no gloves. And we had to be separated by people. But you're on the same team. So it's no different than after you guys fight, you guys shake hands and you guys walk away. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. There was one occasion where I got in a fight with one of the guys at the gym, but he just so happened to be staying with me. We came to blows, but then as soon as it was done, we're like, all right, he was actually staying at my house, so I had to give him a ride home. So it was just one of those things, man. The tempers get going, the adrenaline gets going, all these things, and some guys get frustrated on certain days because they're all training for something specific, if they're in fight camp and if it's not working for them, they get mad and upset. And yeah, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that play into it. But at the end of the day, we're all teammates, and you guys learn to, we learn to shake it off and work with each other.
I've talked to a bunch of other fighters, and I've asked them the same question. Back in the early days of MMA, events were nothing like it is today. Do you have any crazy or wild amateur fight stories? Some fighters have told me they didn't know who they were fighting. The person they were supposed to fight didn't show up. No blood work, no change rooms. Do you have any crazy or wild stories?
I mean, those are all common. Those are all common stories. I don't really have any crazy stories, but that's common. My first couple fights, my first fight actually, we all showed up. I paid $25 to fight, and we weighed everyone that came to fight, and then they said, okay, right there on the spot, they weighed us, probably 2 hours before the fight started, and they matched you the best they could. My fourth fight, I want to say it was my fourth fight. I had no one to fight. I weighed 169. I had no one to fight. And Trevor Prangley had fought this guy. He was about 205 pounds. Trevor had fought him a couple months before that, and Trevor had beat him pretty easily. And even though Trevor was a lot bigger than me, and Trevor was, a really good wrestler and all, Trevor handled him. And I know that there was moments where I was training with Trevor, and I'd have some good moments with him on the ground and grappling and this and that. So I was like, you know what, forget it. I took the fight. The guy was 210 pounds, 205 pounds, something like that. And I only weighed in at 169. So that was one of them, and it was one of those fights where, man, I didn't want to get hit by him, this and that. And I was not having my way with him, but it was a close fight. He was a little nervous of stepping in and getting, because I was faster than him. He didn't want to be on bottom, but there was a couple times where he was trying to get me down. And one time he left his face open as he was trying to get on my leg, and I swung back and I actually hammer fisted him right in the nose and just busted his nose, blood everywhere. And it just changed the whole dynamic of the fight. The whole fight was just a mess after that, just blood everywhere. And so, I ended up winning the fight, but it was just one of those fights. I got in there and it was a way tougher fight than I had planned and thought it would be, but it was able to get the win. There's a lot of stories. There's stories that I can, there was one with Dennis Holman, Benji Raddick, and all those guys. They were fucking with Frank Shamrock at one of the shows, and they had came and tilted a trash can full of water against his door and knocked on the door, and Frank opened it and flooded his whole hotel room. And so Frank peeked down the hall and he saw it was them, and he took off after them. Well, they all ran into their rooms. He kicked the door down, and they all jumped out the window. So he kicked the door down, ran into their rooms, and they all jumped out the window. Well, that was their room. So he started just going through all their stuff, got their phones, got their watches, got all their stuff, and then threw it all threw it all in the bathtub. And so like he filled up the bathtub with water and threw all their stuff in the bathtub and just fucked all their shit up. And like stories like that, there's, you know, tons of stories. I mean, not even like small level shows. I mean, yeah, I could tell you so many things, man. The list is long, man.
That's wild. Now, when did you really feel like you've kind of, I guess, accomplished the goal of becoming a professional fighter? For you, was it your first stint in the UFC? Was it Strikeforce? When did you really feel that, all right, you know what, I'm here, I'm a pro fighter, sky's the limit?
Yeah, I would say it was the first fight in the UFC. Not only like it's not the first fight; it's the first fight, the first time you get a win. Just for me, it happened to be my first fight in the UFC. You know, that's all it is. Like once you get a win at that level and you feel good about it, and you know, and then my second fight with Hermes Franca, that was a really tough fight. You know, that was like it's one of those fights where I figured out who I was as a fighter. If I was a quitter, if I was someone that could fight through things and in the adversity of it all and keep fighting. And it told me a lot about myself, and it told me a lot about myself in terms of I knew that I wasn't just like a guy fighting at the club or the bar, you know, and was a bully. I was somebody that even though I would dominate the first 2 rounds, I got dropped at the beginning of the third round and got smashed for like 2.5 minutes. And there was never a moment in my mind where I was like, okay, just tap and give up and turn over from, you know, and just take the easy way out. And so I ended up finishing the round better than he did in the third round after I got dropped and just destroyed for like 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes. I just took tons of punishment in that 2.5 minutes. And I just got my breath about me and came back. And those type of fights are the fights I think some fighters, when people say they want to go to war, they want to know something about themselves. They want to know if they're a quitter. They want to know if they're game to go out on their shield. They want to know those things. And a lot of the guys are, but you're going to find some guys are not. Some guys, like when it gets tough, they'll turn and give their back to give up a submission. They'll reach and extend their arms to try and give up an arm bar. You know what I mean? Like you can kind of sometimes tell certain athletes are that way, and some fighters are fighters. They're going to bite down on their mouthpiece and continue to fight as long and as hard as they possibly can until the ref stops it. So that was one of those fights that I dug deep, and I realized that I was truly a fighter, and it made me realize that I belonged in the sport, that I belonged at the highest level.
Now, after leaving the UFC, after your first stint there, was the plan for you to always try and, you know, work back to get in the UFC? Obviously, at Strikeforce, you had great success by winning a championship there. But did you always kind of view the UFC as like number one on the totem pole?
You know, when I was there the first time, yeah. You know, I thought it was because there was no other shows. You know, Strikeforce wasn't around yet. Realistically, it was the UFC. It was King of the Cage. And it was the WEC, I believe WEC was, you know, and those were all kind of like local shows for us as well. Like in California, they were pretty active in the California scene, you know. So the WEC was always at Lemoore, which is only like 2.5, 3 hours away from me. And there was always fights there. For a while there, the Ultimate Athlete was around, you know, until they had that big riot down there in, I want to say Palm Springs or Palm Desert or whatever it is, you know. Yeah, it was one of those. It's like I don't know. It's just there was always the UFC was always, yeah, I guess considered number one, but then I didn't have this. I wouldn't say always. Like Pride definitely was number one first, and then when the UFC got rid of the lightweight division altogether from like 2004 to 2006 or something like that, I didn't look at them. I didn't view them anymore as number one. Because if you're hemorrhaging money and you're cutting weight classes, it doesn't really matter where you go to make money. And then you hear all the stories about guys that never wanted to fight back in the UFC because they were making more money fighting in small shows against guys that they knew they could beat. Like Jeremy Horn was a classic example. You know, the UFC was offering him like, you know, basically they were offering him like 6-6 or 10-10, you know, 20 grand to get a win. And he'd have to fight guys like Chuck Liddell or Tito Ortiz and all those guys. He'd have to fight those guys. And so it didn't make sense when he could fight in small level shows against the guys that come off the bar stool and still make 10 grand flat and he'd fight every weekend and not even get a scratch on him. You know what I mean? So he's making $40,000 a month, fighting scrubs every weekend. Sure, he's got to stay training, but he was doing that anyways. It didn't make. I started hearing all the stories about guys making more money fighting in low level shows, and not having to fight the super tough guys. They're making a killing. And so I stopped viewing the UFC as number one. And then I also just started viewing, Pride was still around at the time because I fought in Pride in between that 2004, 2006 era. I fought in Pride. And I started realizing the show and the presentation and everything that Pride did was so much bigger. It was way bigger than what the UFC was doing. And so I stopped viewing them as number one. But then even when Pride went away, I still didn't view them as number one. Strikeforce came on the scene, and I had a new home, and I was like, all right, well, to me, this is number one. Like, you got to take care of whatever's going on here. And it progressively got better really, really fast. We ended up signing that deal with CBS Showtime, and then it happened so fast. We joined and merged with Elite XC, and then Elite XC folded, and we were the sole promotion on the network. It was crazy, man. It was, yeah. I think after I left the UFC the first time, I didn't view them. I never tried to get back there. There was no reason for me to get back there. I knew what the fighters in the lightweight division were making, when they brought the lightweight division back, and I was making that, if not more, sometimes double from what I had heard, because we had some of our fighters were managed fighters in the UFC. So my manager was the same manager that managed those guys, and he would tell me, he's like, no, you're making more money, just stay where you're at. And so that's, at the end of the day, managers talk, they know what they're making, and for me, I never needed to go back. It became about the 2006, it became about the money. I still love the sport, but it really came down to who's going to pay me more, and whoever pays me more, to me, that's the number one promotion.
Now, in which ways did winning the Strikeforce title really change your life and positively benefit you?
There was a lot of things, I think, at that time that I was going through that needed to change. And it was one of those things where I took a lot of things. I wouldn't say took a lot of things for granted. I went through a rough phase in my life, and lost my dad and lost my grandmother, all within a year or two, and it just was a shitty situation to be in, and one thing is, if I would have taken it more serious, I think when I was younger, they would have been able to see me win a world title, but instead I was still, like I said, I have that kind of was living that John Jones life a little bit of, being out at the club, being out, till 2 a.m. on a Wednesday or a Thursday, it wasn't good. I was still training every Thursday and Friday, but I was still out, you know what I mean? So just, I never knew what my real potential was until I started putting all that stuff aside and really focusing on the training. Even after my stint in the UFC, sure, I focused on training, but I was still, in and out of hanging out and being at the clubs, and, and drinking, and and doing all those things. So it's nice to, I think, in that time, the title it meant a lot to me, but it wasn't as gratifying as it would have been had I won it earlier for my my dad to see, or my grandmother to see, or what I mean. It wasn't what it could have been. So I just looked at that as another stepping stone to continue to just get better. I didn't take anything for granted after that, and I actually trained harder after I won the title. It just motivated me to be better, try and train harder, do more, add more things into my training, things that were different, things that people weren't doing. And it just motivated me more. That's all.
Now, years ago, for the life of me, I can't really remember what I was watching, but I was watching something on television, and it was you, and you went back, it looked like you visited a group of kids. I don't know if it was I wanted it was a reform school or a juvenile hall or something.
Yeah.
And you brought the belt back with you and explained your whole story. Hey, listen, I went through this, and that. Is that something, after winning the belt, after really realizing, wow, I need to change my life around, I made it this far. Is that something you enjoy doing, trying to help kids and people that could be in your situation?
Yeah, I do enjoy it. I mean, I own two two gyms. I own a martial arts gym and a fitness gym, and I work with a lot of kids. Now I enjoy working with the kids, but that one segment that you're talking about, I actually was in that juvenile hall that was here in San Jose when I was a kid. And so when I went back there, I wanted to let them all understand and know that like I was in here, like at your age, I was in here, and like now look where I'm at now. Like it doesn't have to be this way. Your life, it's a choice whether you want to be successful or not. It's up to you. That's all it is. It has to do with your life choices. You want to surround yourself with the wrong people, and try and be cool. Well, those people eventually will move on, and they'll either get a girl that will take care of them, or a wife that will take care of them, or they'll end up in jail or whatever it is, but they'll move on. They may not be in your life your whole life. Like you need to you need to set goals for yourself. I said, for me, I've always looked at it this way. Like I was never the best wrestler. I was never the best soccer player, and you could potentially say I was never the best fighter, but I was always good at what I did. But it was a choice for me to be successful. I wanted to be good at all these things. Maybe I wasn't the best, but I enjoyed doing it. But my point is that all those kids in that juvenile hall, all those kids that are, in gangs, they're all better than me at something. Just because I'm on TV, or just because I was a world champion, or just because I was one of the best fighters in the world for years, it doesn't mean that they're not better than me at something. Maybe they're all better than me at baseball. Maybe they're all better than me at cooking. I don't know, but they could be better than me at anything. Maybe they're better than me at math, and they got to find what they really enjoy doing and what they're good at. Sometimes what you're good at isn't always what you enjoy doing, but that is probably the easiest way to make yourself successful. Like, I don't know. I liked wrestling, and I was better at wrestling than I was at soccer, but I enjoyed soccer more. But I let wrestling take me to college, and I let wrestling, make money. Wrestling led me to making money, so I didn't really wrestle. I didn't like wrestling as much because I hated cutting weight, and I hated like the constant grind in a 98-degree room. And like it was fun. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't what it was. Like I enjoyed soccer more, but it's not always what you enjoy doing the most that makes you successful. And I'm so glad that I continue to wrestle, because it made me a better fighter in the long run, which is my ultimate goal, is to make money.
UFC eventually was able to buy out Strikeforce. Strikeforce was no longer in existence. Traveled back to the UFC. First fight back was a guy named Mr. Nate Diaz. That fight was absolutely insane. I don't even remember how many times you had to head kick him to finally finish him. But fighting a guy like Diaz, I mean, like people say you can't knock out a Diaz. Just how much of a dogfight was that? And did you just enjoy that fight?
It wasn't a dogfight at all for me. It was me just trying to be a sniper and not trying to stand in front of him and exchange. I knew that that's where he made his living. Like it was a no-brainer. I watched how guys had fought his brother Nick from Carlos Condit and GSP and how they beat him. And I realized that how Carlos Condit and GSP beat Nick, and then how Benson Henderson beat Nate the fight before me. And so when I saw that, I just realized what the game plan was. The game plan was to stick and move, land clean shots, and get out. Don't get engaged into a dogfight, because then you're playing with fire. So there was that, and then I also learned that they don't check kicks. They have such a sideways boxing stance that they don't check kicks, and so that I've always loved the kick. I had to make sure that I didn't allow them to catch my kicks. And so I just had to set them up off of my stance. The other thing that I worked on for that fight that had worked for me against Gilbert Melendez in the fight before that was or two fights before that, sorry, was switching my stance. Is keep them guessing. I switched from southpaw to orthodox and back and forth, and it made a huge difference, man. It made a huge difference he never had an opportunity to set himself and throw. So as far as like beating Nate, I don't sure it was great on how it all happened, and especially the comeback to the UFC. It was good to let everyone know that, but I also it was one of those things where it was like a lot of things happened after that that were like upsetting. So it kind of takes away from the excitement of the win over Nate. Like I was supposed to get the title shot after that, and then apparently Pettis got hurt. And then after that, I ended up fighting Benson, losing a split decision, just a bunch of stuff. Like it was kind of a bittersweet. I felt like the UFC, that there was no desire from them to push me to to fight for their title. They ended up giving Gil a second title fight. After I lost to Benson, after he beat Diego. It just was one of those. It was one of those situations and scenarios where I felt like they had no interest in promoting me, and that's when I realized I was kind of already 1 foot out and waiting for the potential of Coker getting his own promotion or doing his own thing after his non-compete was up. I figured that he wasn't going to stay with the UFC long. He just wasn't one of those guys. And also, we didn't really talk a whole lot, during that time. But I just knew. I was like, he's not someone that likes to work for other people. He likes to kind of run the show. And I knew that he didn't want to work for the UFC. It just was pretty obvious, And so I knew that eventually, like I was already kind of 1 foot out after the Benson fight. I was like, look, they're not going to give me a title shot. It doesn't matter who I beat, And I asked for Cowboy Cerrone, I asked for RDA, I asked for all the top guys, and they kept trying to give me guys that weren't even ranked in the top 15. And I'm like, nah, I'm good, man. So I already knew. I pretty much knew that I was 1 foot out. And I think you saw that in my next two performances, like, with Bobby Green. I just didn't care. It was supposed to be Michael Johnson. Fight fell through. And Michael Johnson wasn't even ranked in the top 10 at the time, I don't think, or maybe he was 10. They weren't giving me anybody or any respect. So I already knew. I was 1 foot out.
Were you at all kind of disappointed when Strikeforce ended? I mean, you had such a great career, though, there. Was that kind of, I don't know, sad a little bit just to see that all end?
Yeah, it was sad. It was sad only because I knew we had the better fighters, and it's obvious now. I mean, like all of them became champions. Robbie Lawler was the champion there. Remember, the UFC cut Robbie Lawler thinking he was washed up and done. Then he comes back and he becomes their champion. 10 years later or whatever it is. Like it just doesn't. I don't. They're quick to write people off instead of building stars. And I see that Strikeforce was able to build up new people. Nick Diaz, same thing. They let Nick Diaz go, years ago. And then Nick Diaz basically redid himself. And when he redid himself, he became champion of Strikeforce. And then I still, to this day, him and Paul Daly is probably the best number one first, like, 1 round fight ever in history of MMA. I mean, it was insane. And I just feel like we had the better guys, and not just the better guys, but we had the guys that were there because they loved the sport. The game's changed now. The audience has changed. I mean, it's so clustered with just show after show after show. People just lose interest in the athletes now, and they only just care about the promotion, which is what the UFC has done a good job of. But the bottom line is that we're trying to build up fighters and athletes. So if you're trying to be a young fighter that you're trying to build up to become a star and make a lot of money, then Bellator is probably the place for you. UFC, like they showed with Robbie Lawler and they showed with Nick Diaz, they don't care. Like once you've lost 1 or 2, you're out. Doesn't matter. Like, be gone. You know what I mean? And they're not into building stars. They're into getting their fights. And if you don't do it, then you're gone. And that's kind of how they do. That's how they've done business for the longest time. And I think some of these guys, there's still a lot of fight in them, the ones that have left, and we've seen it. We've seen it from the guys in the past, from Diaz and Lawler, and we're going to see it, I think, now as well. Daly still has some good fights in him. Ryan Bader has some good fights in him. Gegard Mousasi, he was the number 1 contender when he left. He just left back to Scott because he enjoys doing business with Coker. So there's a lot to be said on why guys leave, and I think every fighter should be testing the free market to see what the fighters don't do is they apparently don't pay attention to what the bigger sports organizations are doing. The NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball. If they were smart, they'd all pay attention to what those guys are doing. Because just like Anthony Johnson, when they let him go because he didn't make weight and had a bad performance against Vitor Belfort, when they let him go, He went to PFL, knocked everybody out, and then comes back and he's making triple what he was making before. Had he stayed in the UFC, he would have been making like a quarter or a half of what he was making. But then he left, became a star in another organization, and was knocking dudes out. Beat Andre Arlovsky, beat somebody else. Like, he beat all these guys and was just mopping guys up and knocking them out at heavyweight. Then they brought him back, and he fought at 205, which was starching everyone there as well. He was making a ton of money, like $500,000-$600,000 a fight. That's a lot of money, and so he would have never been making that had he stayed in the UFC. Testing the free market agency is the best thing a lot of these guys can do. Fight out your fights, see what other companies will offer you, and get an idea of what you're really worth, and then go back and try to negotiate, or don't negotiate and just go to another company. Because if you're successful in the other company as well, they're going to want you back. The UFC's, they showed it with Anthony Johnson. They're going to take you back as long as you're winning. And if you're winning and you're doing well, they're going to for sure take you back. And you're probably going to get paid more money to leave that other promotion and come over there and fight for them. That's just how it goes. Like, that's the business. Like, you have these guys, these fighters are just so in awe, I don't know, of either Dana White or the UFC name and the brand, and just want to say that, I've had plenty of fighters reach out to me saying these things. Like, oh, I don't know if I leave, there's a lot of things I would lose and this and that. If enough people leave, and then it becomes a real, like, my team's trying to get your quarterback. And if that happens, then we start having good fights. You start seeing the best guys rise to the top, and then you may potentially even see cross promotions, where you get rid of free market agency, and then you just start seeing cross promotion. You never know. So I don't know. I think every fighter needs to test that free market agency and see exactly what they're worth. And if you guys, and like I said, winning solves everything. If you keep winning, doesn't matter. Look at Tiger Woods. All that shit he went through, everything. As soon as he won, he won the Masters or something like that. He won another event. All of a sudden, no one cared about what he did in the past. All they cared about was that. John Jones, all the trouble he's been in. As soon as he wins one or two fights, no one even talks about the past. So when he does come back, no one's going to care about what he just did. They're not going to say, like, oh, he discharged a firearm in city limits. Oh, he was drunk, during quarantine. No one's going to talk about that. All they're going to care about is his fight and his win. And so, like I said, if fighters are out there testing the free market agency and, seeing what they're worth, from the UFC, if they're going to, whether it's one, whether it's Bellator, whatever, like, see what you're worth, see what you can make, and take a page out of the NFL players and the Major League Baseball players. They bounce from team to team because they go where the money is. That's as long as you're winning solves everything.
Now, last question for you, Josh. While your fighting career is no longer, you announced your retirement. You're still keeping very busy by doing your podcast, by doing commentating. How did you get into, like, let's say, the podcast side of things, and how do you enjoy it?
I got into it because I didn't work, but I was on this morning radio station a lot for a lot of my promotions for my fights, because I fought in San Jose a lot. So there was a radio station here called 102.5 KDON, and I had been on that show so many times to promote my fights that I became friends with the morning hosts. There was two of them, Showbiz and Sam Diggity. And so I became really good friends with them, and we started seeing the success that Brennan was having with his show. And I said, well, why don't, and so Sam hit me up and was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing a podcast for the radio station. I was like, you interested in doing one together? And he's like, yeah, that's why I'm calling you. So we started doing one together, and that we started off with doing Sammy and the Punk. And then after we did Sammy and the Punk, and then, a couple of years later, Big John and I started working together for Bellator. And I basically saw what UFC was doing with Ariel Helwani and Chael. And I said to myself, I was like, it's good if I have a show with somebody who I'm close with, and John and I became close during the times that we had worked together. And then it's good that I have somebody that nobody else has. So the two of us have something that, John could have done it with another fighter, but it's good to work with somebody but we work well together. That's one. And two is that we have a relationship. I don't want to say it's like a father and son kind of thing, but it has that feel of like he says, and I love hearing his input because he has a different input. He has a different outlook on things than I would ever have, because I have the fighter perspective and he has the referee perspective. But he's also owned a gym. I own gyms now. He used to own a gym, doesn't own it anymore. Like he has a lot of the inside backstories from like the old UFC days that I would have never been around, because I was younger at the time and I wasn't in the UFC at the time, or even when I was in the UFC, I wasn't privy to that information. And all the stuff that went along with this, those are things that nobody else can bring to a podcast. So when I was thinking in terms of like, hey, John had brought it up one day that he had a podcast and he had like 100,000 subscribers or something like that. And Dana had basically told him that he needed to delete it. And so he had to stop doing it. And so now that he was no longer a ref and he worked for Bellator and the two of us worked for Bellator, I asked him, I said, do you want to get back in the game and do it? I'm like, it gives us something to do and something to talk about our athletes, and as well as, doing research on the young, new up and coming guys. And so he's like, yeah, let's go. Let's do it. So, he went out and got all the equipment he needed to film it. And, he films out of like almost near Knoxville, Tennessee, and we FaceTime into each other. And then I've got a producer that catches all the information and, and he puts it all together and we put it up. But realistically, it was kind of a no-brainer. Like I said, work with someone that has a lot to say, loves the sport, has been around for a long time, and could bring something to the table that nobody else can bring. And there's no better person than Big John. Very humble guy, very very direct and to the point. And trust me, there's been a lot of times where, like I said, was that father and son kind of relationship where I've said some things and he's like, Josh, you can't do that, man. He's like, you can't say those things. Not on base of the fact that they're not factual. Just based on the fact that like you could be tearing someone's, you could be hurting someone's career. And as a younger person, I'm like, yeah, but that's the truth. Yeah, sometimes the truth doesn't always need to be told. Like especially if you're not asked, when you're volunteering the information. So I think I've learned a lot from him on the approach on things. Like I've learned a lot from a lot of other people throughout my career. But the young Josh would have been like, you don't know what you're talking about. Fuck it. I'm going to say what I want and be a rebel and be a punk. And this Josh now is like, okay, let's just dial it back and, let's try to stay on everyone's, not just stay on everyone's good side, but be correct about it. Be not politically correct, but just be courteous as to on how you should treat people, and would you want someone to say the same things about you? That's the thing.
Absolutely, Josh. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, man. And I wish you nothing but the best of luck going forward, brother.
My man, pleasure. You can hit me up anytime. If you ever have any questions or anything like that, you can hit me up anytime.